Hello everyone, welcome back to the NPC Dungeon. Today's episode will be a little different than my usual format. Instead of taking a single concept and breaking it up into several points, or just kind of exploring the topic, today I'm looking at some of the things that I wish I knew as a DM when I first started, and that I think are pretty important, in the hope that all of you can take this and avoid some of the mistakes that I made early on in my experience. But enough of that, let's get started and let's learn something. First up is one that you might be able to guess if you've been with me for a while now. For those of you who have, you'll know that I like to keep my campaigns character motivated and character driven, and that's it. When I first began many years ago, I just kind of made a story and threw my players into it. It ended up feeling kind of flat, and my players weren't terribly motivated to advance the plot. I wish I knew the benefits of not only using character backstories, but also of building the story around them. It provides so much inspiration and gives your players a built-in reason to be invested right out of the gate. I'll talk more about this in more depth in my series on immersion and in my series on the beginnings and ends of campaigns, links in the descriptions and cards up above, obviously. But for now, it's hard to overstate just how useful this is. I realize it isn't for every group, but I still highly recommend giving it a try. Wait to really come up with the bulk of your story until you have backstory, and then during the campaign, make sure the bulk of the action happens to or around the players. When I was still beginning, it was tempting to have all the action happen in the background with subtle political moves or battles the players weren't part of, but if your players aren't involved, why will they involve themselves? Give them a reason to. Go into their backstory, look at their character's personality, or even look at something in the world they care about and then use that. There's always a way. It may require some creativity, but we're creative people, we can handle it. But that isn't to say that the plot should take a back seat. Story is also super important, and my second point is all about making sure your games don't meander. But wait, you might be thinking, didn't you just say to keep everything character driven? Now you're saying that I should keep everything related to the plot? Exactly. I see no reason why you can't do both. After all, if the plot is based on character backstory, the two will be one and the same, and anything related to the plot will, for the most part, be related to the characters as well. This wasn't so obvious to me when I first started. As I've said before on this channel, my solution was complete freedom. My players could do whatever they wanted, but I didn't really give them any goals, so the story wandered with no real sense of purpose, and the encounters got pretty random pretty fast. And other times, I would just introduce a monster because I thought it was cool, and it didn't really have much to do with the rest of the story. I wish I knew how important it was to keep encounters and such themed to the rest of the story. If your plot involves a bunch of bugs rising up out of the ground, you better have a bunch of bug encounters ready. If your players are underground, give them some subterranean monsters. But it doesn't all have to be monsters. What's going on underground? Maybe someone wants the players to get rid of the bugs. There could be a social encounter brewing. I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of random encounter tables. I prefer to plan out my encounters so they fit the narrative of what's going on and the players involved. But don't get me wrong, you can certainly make your own random encounter tables to suit your story, but I caution against just saying they'll run into an owlbear or 3 pixies or something of the sort. When designing encounters, I find it best to try to come up with a scenario. Maybe the owlbear is stuck in a hunter's trap, and maybe the hunter is nearby. That can be really interesting depending on the party. Maybe the pixies play a prank on one of the players. I actually tell a story about a time I did that to one of my players on this channel before. If you want to hear it, I'll leave a link below and a card above. And if you want to hear more about how I structure encounters, I'll leave a link and a card for that as well. But all that sounds fine for small scale encounters, but what about for large scale encounters like parties and prison breaks where seemingly anything can happen? Well, I'm actually talking about that next. For the longest time, I was so afraid to do larger scale social encounters, like those at a party or in a prison or in any other big open space where a lot of things can happen. It took me until just recently to realize that that's it, that's the key. A lot of things can happen. You can think of every large scale encounter as just being made up of smaller encounters. If your players are at a party, the people they may interact with are smaller encounters. The same goes for prisons and dungeons. Think about what they might do and where they might go and what they might do while they're there. In this way, it's really not that different from planning for a dungeon where you come up with a bunch of different rooms and then track your players' progress through them. And the same is true for battles. Don't just put your players in the fray. Find a smaller, simpler encounter within the battle to do. Maybe your player's job is to sneak around and attack someone important or steal something important. Doing it this way, and really even only thinking about it this way, saves you a lot of trouble, but it also takes something that looks really complicated and multifaceted and breaks it down into much simpler component parts. And in situations like these, improv really helps. Obviously, improv is really important in D&D, but I didn't realize just how instrumental to improv planning was until later on, so that's what I'm going to talk about next. It might sound like a contradiction, but hear me out. Just because you don't know what your players are going to do, that doesn't mean that you don't plan. In fact, I think it gives you a reason to plan even more. Here's what I mean. I like to try to imagine every possible direction that an encounter can go in that I can think of, and then review and think about everything going on in the background in the story, so that when my players inevitably do none of what I'd planned for, I can use that to pull from and have pre-existing inspiration to work off of and tailor the encounters to what they might then do. I find this a lot easier to improv when you have something to build off of, so having these alternatives in mind and everything that happened in the story in mind really helps. Think about what your players might do. Think about what you would do. Think about how the world would react, and think about how you think you should run all this in practice. Even though it'll probably not happen in any of those ways, you're coming in prepared, and that's half the battle. But that's not everything you might know as a DM. There are a lot of other responsibilities that you have that I wish I knew when I began. The DM doesn't just run the game, you are also there to arbitrate rules. In the inevitable case when we forget a rule or when there's a rule ambiguity, the call is yours to make. You're also there to settle and handle disputes. If there's a disagreement, it's probably best that you play a role in handling it. If there's a player causing problems, people are going to look to you for help. And of course, there's the ever difficult task of scheduling. A lot of us are adults with lives and jobs, or maybe even school, and it can be tough to map out time once a week for everyone to meet for 4 or 5 hours. Obviously, everyone needs a say, and the DM doesn't, or at least shouldn't, have complete authority. You're a DM, not a tyrant, but you as the DM will often end up doing a lot of the work in these areas. Check your players' availabilities, text them before the sessions, and even check on them after the sessions. See how they're doing and ask if they're all having fun. That's the goal after all. And lastly, in this same vein, I'm going to end off by saying that I wish I saw the value of session zeros. I used to not have session zeros. Instead, I would just kind of try to handle issues as they arose, but session zeros can be a great way of laying the foundation and setting ground rules for how these things might be handled when they come up. It also just gives the players a chance to talk and settle into the game before it actually begins, which is useful not only with players who may not know each other, but also in general when trying to boost group cohesion when the campaign actually starts. Session zeros are also a good way of just seeing what everyone wants out of the game, so that we can ensure that everyone has fun and feels welcome. But that's it for today. Feel free to check out this week's story. It's part of the story that I've been telling recently, and the second in which Seraphina, the Paladin Angel, was absent. So it doesn't end up being all that long, but I still hope you enjoy it. Be sure to come back next week where I'll share some of my thoughts on running short campaigns and talk about Seraphina's introduction back into the story. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. Until next time, let's learn something.